This is our antique plaster board. We're going to start, we always use first a dark base coat that match our dark plaster. The plaster has been tinted with raw amber pigment, and this is a stippler brush that we're going to use to apply our first layer. So we first load the brush and then start to stipple the surface. Be sure you're not building too much material and you're spreading the plaster all over the surface. You want to achieve really an even coat. And we always try to twist the brush so we don't repeat the same pattern. We can allow a little bit of space left between the application, but not too much. And at this point, we have to let it dry for 15-20 minutes. Now the surface is dry. If you have a little too much texture, you can use a 220 sandpaper and slightly sand the surface. Or if you've done a correct job, you're ready to start. Now we're going to use a stainless steel trowel, and it's very important to put very little material at a time on the blade. And then you apply over the surface and push very hard. The goal of a good Venetian plaster application is to have very little material at the time. That's one of the mistakes that most people commit during the beginning of their technique. Too much material will ruin the final process. Also, when you apply the plaster on the surface, it's basically two movements. You're applying first, and then I clean my blade and come back over the surface and remove the excess. That's the basic technique of the Venetian plaster. We're using an open pattern, a skip trowel application, so we're applying all over the surface, but we're leaving spots open for the next layer. And now we're going to let this layer dry for 15-20 minutes. Now the surface is dry and we're ready to apply the second layer of plaster. Again, it will be a skip trowel technique, and we're going to apply the plaster in the area that we left open on the previous layer. Otherwise, the technique is always the same, always very minimum plaster under the blade, and we're applying it by putting pressure on the surface. You always want to try to apply the plaster in a crisscross motion. Try to go against the application of the previous layer. And now it's time to let this layer dry. Now the plaster is dry. The next step is going to be the application of our first layer of stencil. So we're going to position the stencil on the surface using some masking tape to attach it. And very important, because this is a multi-layer stencil, we need to have a registration mark. Now, you don't want to mark the plaster because that will become permanent. So we're using masking tape underneath the little corner of our registration mark. And then with the pencil, we mark the little corners. Now we're ready to apply the plaster. It's going to be a plaster of a different color, tinted with raw sienna. Sometimes we use a spray adhesive to avoid the seeping of the plaster through the stencil, but in this case it's really not as important because part of the antiquing process will be the final layer when we come back with a darker plaster. So this kind of marks are not going to be that visible. Also, the spray adhesives sometimes leave residue on the Venetian plaster, which are not very suitable. So we're getting ready to start. We're going to try to do again a light application. Not to insist on the same spot for too many passes, otherwise more plaster will go through the stencil. And especially on the larger open area of the stencil, I try to push from the outside to the inside, so again I will avoid heavier seeping of plaster through the stencil. Now we're ready, we can delicately remove the stencil. Generally, I prefer to do as the plaster is still wet, so the stencil doesn't get stick and glue to the surface. And now we have to let dry this first pass. Sometimes if you have some of the plaster that penetrates through the stencil, you can remove some of the heavier application with a wet sponge. You can go around and remove some of the material. But I tended to do that only for the larger area because overall it will disappear with the final application of the raw amber plaster. We're now ready for the next step. We're going to apply the second stencil by using our registration mark, overlapping with the previous one. And again, we're going to repeat the same operation, a little bit of plaster at a time. Again, it's okay if you miss few spots, because the entire process at the end, it will be a textural effect. So the dark raw amber plaster will overlap over the raw sienna plaster. I like to pay particular attention to the small detail of the delicate design of the Grottesca, because there it's important to have a good coverage. And now we're done. We're going to again carefully lift the stencil. And we're going to let it dry again until the next layer. Now our stencil layer is dry. We're going to take again our raw plaster tinted layer and apply over the entire surface. We're using this plaster as a antiquing layer. So again, we're putting little plaster at a time on the blade and travel over the entire image. We make sure, of course, that it's a very thin layer. We're spreading it around again in a skip trowel motion. In some area I can go heavier, especially at first, and then wipe off some of the plaster so I see reappearing the design underneath. That way I can create an illusion of aging, of process of chipping off of the lighter plaster and pushing the surface, the design back into the surface. You see the image slowly disappear into the surface. And now we're going to let it dry again until the surface is slowly dry. We can finally burnish and see the underneath image reappear through the layer of plaster. Now the plaster is dry and we're ready to burnish the surface. You need to put quite a bit of pressure and work especially with the weight of your body and with the shoulder. You will move much faster and get a better burnish this way. Now the surface is very smooth and it's ready for the wax. This time I'm going to apply the wax directly with my trowel. This pass is much faster and easier. I don't have to put the same pressure that I do when I actually burnish the plaster. And now I'll wait until the wax is dry and I can finish the project by polishing the surface. The wax is now dry and I'm ready to burnish the surface. This time I'm going to use my trowel and burnishing and polishing the surface at the same time. And that's it. Now our antique plaster panel is finished. Now we're going to have an overview of our process. We start by stippling the plaster over the surface, let it dry, applying the first layer in a skip trowel manner with open space, let it dry, and finish the second layer by closing in over the area that we skip in the first layer. Then we let the process dry and we apply our stencil with several overlay in a different color plaster. We let that dry and finally come back with the first color, the raw umber base that we start from, and antique and distress the surface that way. When that process was dry, we applied clear wax, let the wax dry, and finish the entire process with the same trowel, polishing the surface over the wax. This is one of many in our series of DVD. For more information, check Vigini Studio at viginistudio.com. Thank you for watching and good luck with your work.